AI, accelerated cloud adoption, and hybrid work are fundamentally shifting how business gets done. The old way of securing your people, apps, and data doesn't work and scale anymore. To stay ahead, today's organizations need to reimagine their security and networking infrastructure with a cloud-first, unified SASE architecture. Join Palo Alto Networks and leading technologists from across the globe for SASE Converge 2023, a two-day virtual experience, November 15th through 16th, revealing how SASE, powered by advanced AI, can drive better security and networking outcomes. Register today at securityweekly.com/Palo Alto. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Dan Moore about secure by design and secure by default in OAuth and WebAuthn, and how standards must adapt over time to new threats. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and maybe some gremlins, and it's just about time for the news. But first, one announcement this time. We are celebrating the milestone of reaching over 1,000 members of our CISO community. The Cybersecurity Collaboration Forum is a one-stop shop for executive collaboration comprised of CISOs across various industries. It's also a tongue twister. If you want to be part of this growing community of CISOs, join us as a member or technology partner. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/cybersecuritycollaboration. And I have to apologies up front, John. I think we needed 65 million or so
Yes.
punch cards to record our last episode. I got counted up to like 12 and sort of lost
And that didn't take into account either.
That's going to take a while.
The browser side or all the rendering, or excuse me, all the recording stuff we have too. So yeah, those numbers go quickly.
Exactly. It's good to know that our ASW is more complex and complicated than an Apollo mission. So this is what we bring to all of you listeners. We also bring you answers to questions. And this actually, we've got an AP I don't know segment that I want to bring back. When working in Appsec, how do you know if the engineering culture is going to accept your ideas? As in, what kind of questions should one ask in interviews to suss out if the engineering culture is set up to accept an Appsec person?
Yeah. And so to me, this was, I broke this down initially into two parts. And I think it's going to be interesting to sort of see how our two brains sort of answered this from different points of view. But for me, the first thing for me is so there's two questions here and two aspects to this question. One is, is engineering leadership open to new ideas? Or are you working with an engineering leadership team that are like, we're going this direction, we have put all our effort into, we know where we're going, that's where we're going, you're just another worker bee. Mm-hmm. And then second aspect around this is that leadership or the overall team, she used the phrase cultural, but overall, are they open to improving their application security, or are they at a happy place? Because this is, and it's one thing to look at this if you are coming into a company versus if you're already inside that company and try to figure, okay, how do we play with these things? We can go on to this for a long time, so I'm going to try and keep it short. But so if the questions I came up with are coming from the point of view of if you're coming into a company and you're in this like an interview process, or maybe you're shifting teams and you're trying to figure, okay, I want to be in a place where I can contribute and have what I say really make impact on the company. So you're trying to figure, okay, is that team that you're talking to, are they going to be open to that? And it's a pretty important question. So Mike, I had two, which I came up with. The first question was, how do you go about building a roadmap and prioritizing new features? Once you're executing that roadmap, how do you manage to keep projects on time while dealing with outages and escalations? So there's at face value, this is it's a project management question. But the thing is, when you're asking this of a dev manager already in a team, what you're my question is not asking directly, because if you ask directly, you put me,
do you care about Appsec? We take it seriously.
If you ask me this, obviously not everyone's, I was just about to say not everyone is quite as well spoken as I am, as I'm stumbling over my words. But right, I've done this management thing for a while. If I don't want to answer your question, I'm going to just dance around it, and we'll still be here all day. So you got to ask a question, sort of figure out where their heads is. And then the second one, excuse me, what does the incident response plan look like? If there's a vulnerability in software tonight, tell me about how the team would respond. Right, and again, I'm not saying do you have a plan, or do you take it seriously, or do you care about your customers? It's like, And what I'm looking for is, does that plan exist? Have they put enough thought into us already that the Appsec plan exists? Or do they respond and say, wow, that's a really great question. We need to work on that. You're the exact person I need to have working on something like that. Or do they say, well, it's never happened yet, and we don't really expect to get compromised, and it's something that we'll deal with it when it comes up, but it probably never will, right? And
we'll burn that bridge while we cross it.
While
exactly.
We cross it. I love it. But I don't know. I'm curious about your point of view on this too.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take the spirit of your open-ended questions as well. And my responses to that are actually relatively generic in the sense that you actually didn't mention Appsec in your suggested questions. The same with me. My questions would be, what do you see as success in this role perhaps a year from now? What are you looking in this role? Which you could kind of apply. That's a generic type of question you could apply to any role. But maybe what I will expand on those, what I'd be looking for, kind of what you were saying. Like, are you just looking for someone to say, we take security seriously, or actually we don't have a plan, we need someone like you to help us to develop it? I would also be looking for the perhaps negative things. I would be worried if they say, well, we have a lot of bug bounty reports coming in, we need somebody to triage that. Or we're running software composition analysis and we need help patching everything. If it's just falling into that narrow managing vulns, one, you're going to burn out. Two, that's not the meaningful impact. And you started this conversation off by really pointing out that aspect of how do you have an impact on the company? Or will this role be set up to have an impact? And that's where I would hope some of the responses would come to the idea of, we need help on design, or we need help on threat modeling, or we need help the tooling aspect so that they can bring in some linters or those SCA tools or something like that. So that's, I guess, what I would more recommend of what I would be watching for the responses to contain, or not to contain for that matter.
And I think a lot of, and this is probably interesting partially on, do we get security, is there people the people going into this type of role, are they coming from the development background or security background? Because I think the way we were both approaching this question is a bit of a social engineering type thing. We're trying to figure out, how do we get that person to talk about what we want them to talk about, not what we're actually asking them. And I think the security folks will be a little more used to that. But yeah, so that's, I don't know, we'd love to hear some user feedback on this. Like, have you been in this position where you've gone into a team and you're like, oh my God, this is not what I'm looking for? Or the exact opposite, like, what questions did you ask? How did you figure out? Or hey, even better yet, let's take a next step. How did you actually improve upon what was there when you didn't hear the answer that you liked? So let us know.
Yeah, let us know. And if you're on the other side, you're the hiring manager for the first Appsec role, tell us, do you have some interview questions that you're looking for to see if that person, how they would fit in and mesh with your engineering team or contribute to the engineering team? And John, the way I get you to talk about topics with social engineering is with segues. So my segue today is picking up from a conversation we had at the Open Security Summit. There was actually a webcast with some others last Friday. And we were talking about vulnerabilities, so hence vulnerabilities on the mind. You have an article here about MTTR, and even on the webcast, I had mentioned, one of the metrics you could follow is the time to fix. But maybe I shouldn't be talking about that.
Yeah, it was funny on the pre-record. This was, you should probably know what we're talking about. This was for the name of the conference was Data-Driven Approach. Come on, computer. On vulnerabilities, application security versus infra. Wow, I really can't talk today. Open Security Summit, what this is part of. But yeah, in our pre-air, we had been talking about MTTR not being really useful, and you missed that, unfortunately. But like, when we went on air, you mentioned MTTR. I'm like, oh. And no, I was expecting Jay Jacobs to respond from Cynthia, and he didn't land on it, or didn't get the chance. But we had a blog post here that he wrote back this June talking about why your MTTR is probably bogus. And really, in a nutshell, there's a few other articles out there on this in the space, but from this point of view, what this one's talking about is just purely the math on that, right? So the idea, why do you think about MTTR? I'm going to call it for right now, mean time to repair. So with that, the idea is, if you're doing a vulnerability management program or application security management program, how do you know if it's being successful or not? And one of those metrics to do that is to say, what's the length of time from when we find out about something until it's fixed? But how do you calculate that? That's what this blog post is talking through. It's like, as you scale, as your as the amount of problems scales up, or as your company scales up, how do you, what is that math around that? Or is that mean time or is it median time? Because the numbers become very different. He shows like a long tail sort of going off and like, well, how's that affecting the math? Because there's going to be a few systems out there which you don't patch, or some vulnerable function which you don't get updated. So it just looks at it from a different point of view, and he goes through three different ways of calculating the math. But the takeaway for me is again that, standard lies, damn lies, and statistics. How do we, when you're using that number to actually think about it, is the number, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, what you care about is the number improving? How is it improving? You're not looking at it so much to benchmark against another company. If you are, then that's where things get, at least I think for me, a little sort of sideways. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and maybe perhaps in my defense, I think the thing that I would care more about, that I would focus on too, is what's your capability to respond in the event of the next Log4j or the curl vulnerability that came out recently. Meaning, can you answer the questions of, asset inventory, where all these vulnerable or, bits of software are, and you're able to do this within a matter of hours, days, or even you have so-called break glass mechanisms if there are emergencies. Meaning you don't have processes that get in the way, or you haven't exercised those processes, or you don't have them because you forgot to hire that Appsec person to figure out how do we respond to when an emergency does come up. Because my eyes will glaze over if we just talk about how to patch all of these dependency third-party vulns that the SCA is throwing at everybody.
Yeah, the numbers are too useless. I mean, really, to me, with a management hat on, I care about is for a specific vulnerability, is it being addressed a lot sooner or a lot later than that team does overall? But then also, is that number improving over time, right? So it's for me, it's a really relative thing. I think part of it also is like actually filtering out a lot of that, the infos and the lows, and like either preferably that doesn't have to go into your calculus, preferably that actually those don't get like into your tracking system in the first place. But it's hopefully that gives folks a little bit to talk about. And then you had a second one. I'm going to hop over. There was an article about companies adopting board level cybersecurity committees. So tell me about that.
Yeah, now, apologies, this is a registration wall to get into the PDF, so you'll have to sign up for that. I try to avoid those. But this was interesting because I was talking to CISOs and I was talking to boards about how do you rate the different factors that contribute to security, and it was pointing out the differences. So, for example, to help illustrate this, 22% of CISOs ranked tracking the percentage of systems with up-to-date patches as an important indicator, an important factor to security, whereas 18% of boards thought this was an important factor. So it's kind of pointing out, are CISOs and boards evaluating the same factors of what contributes to security, where are their differences, where are their similarities. MTTR was on that list as well. But even in all of these, the percentage of CISOs, the percentage of board members, these factors came up only less than 1/5 of the time, less than 20%. So it's even talking about vulns is not necessarily the major thing that everybody cares about. And one other sentence I do want to pull out here is that a significant percentage, to quote, a significant percentage of CISOs in technology, 42%, cite vulnerable systems that were, and here's my emphasis, unknown, unmanaged, or misconfigured. So this kind of builds into our aspect of asset management. If you have your cloud, how much of infrastructure is code do you have managing that cloud? How good can you find these areas of where vulnerabilities are? And if there's an opportunity cost of saying, we're going to fix all those mediums and lows, you're doing that at the expense of going out and finding all of these unknown, unmanaged, misconfigured systems. So that was kind of the soapbox I wanted to stand on and shout from our ASW 65 million punch card show.
Standing way up on top of that little pyramid.
Yeah, I know.
So on the metrics thing, one thing I want to mention also, sort of tied back to everything. It's right there. There's always a way to sort of grab metrics one way or another and figure out if you're doing good or bad. One of the other things I think we mentioned, I don't think we mentioned on air, we mentioned off air, Richard Searson, who previously written another one, is sort of How to Measure Anything in Security Risk was one of his popular books, at least one I used to know. He had another book which came out in 2022, The Metrics Manifesto, Confronting Security with Data, which apparently is a little more actionable. So if folks are really interested in this space, that might help sort of figure out how do you measure this stuff so you can report it back up to your board.
And please don't use pie charts. Oh,
yes.
I was going to say, and please don't use pie charts in those reports. But we've got to segue onto another one. So let's keep John's interest. Where do you want to go next?
This hack vector thing caught my eye just because it sounds sort of interesting. So I'll start us off. I'm going to let you go into detail if I can actually talk. Excuse me. Portswigger has something out called hack vector. And I see that it uses XML-like tags to specify the type of encoding conversion used for what?
Good question. A little bit of nuance into this. Hackverter will be the pronunciation I will go with here. But setting that aside, it is a plugin for Burp where you can decode responses and encode requests. And the reason you would use this is if those responses or requests are base64 encoding, or they're using their XOR encoded for that reason, or they are URL encoded or encoded in some manner. And the reason these comes up is you want to look for things like serialization attacks or deserialization attacks. Here is a blob of base64 data, and you want to create a binary string that can do the hello world on the server you're trying to pop. So sometimes those binary strings require specific length fields, et cetera, et cetera. Hackverter can auto-populate that based on some very simple tags where you just want to specify your payload. The same with looking at some of the other types of encoding that may come through, whether it's different UTF-8, UTF-16, character encoding, base64 encoding, base32, or all the other fun bases you can run into within the web world. So it's sort of the way of, rather than trying to have to hand roll and all of your cross-site scripting or SQL injection, whatever exploits, this just does that for you, where you can just decorate within your request or response, say, here's the payload I want to use. Please put it into the right encoding format that the server is expecting. Conversely, when something comes back, please turn it into plain text so my human brain can read and see, is this a session cookie perhaps, or is this something else that's interesting? So I thought it was a fun tool, and I've been neglecting mentioning tools for quite a long time. So I wanted to bring that back, and I'm glad that it caught your eye.
It's a neat one. I mean, for folks who've done this type of work, you spend a lot of time copying and pasting back to a command line and base64 decode, encode, like, okay, so I'm looking for it, do I have to modify it? So that's super useful. As you're talking through that, I was just looking through they call it the BAP store, the app store for Portswigger for Burp Suite. I don't think I've ever installed a module from here. It's been around for a while, so I'm not saying it's not like brand new, but like for our listeners, not just this tool in specific, but go and click up level and take a look through. There's quite a lot of stuff out there to help you with Burp Suite. So yeah, it looks like a good way to lose a lot of time in a really good way.
Indeed. I know NCC Group has a lot of good stuff in that BAP store as well.
Oh, yeah.
And John, speaking of copying and pasting, I hope you're not doing this on your the Firefox browser that you're running on that dusty X11 machine.
Oh no, you caught me. So yes, we found I just had it up. Damn it. There we go. There it is. This is one of those, is it a vulnerability or not type things. So someone has reported out on the OSS security mailing list. I guess they tried to report this to Firefox and like, not a problem. But what they figured out is for Firefox and X11, for those of you again who are running X11, and I'm not, sorry. But those in that situation, there is a vulnerability where if you go to copy text, you're copying from what's called a select buffer. On Firefox, it looks like with some JavaScript, you can actually inject into that select buffer. So then when the user actually hits copy, they're copying your whatever you put in there. And the risk here is if someone thinks they're copying like a curl blah 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 at a command line, you could go ahead and do sudo rm-rf in front of that and something like whatever. We're all creative people. But so that's the situation. As I mentioned, there's a bit of a fight going on. I think this thread got sort of long. people going back and forth of like, is this an issue or not? So for the folks out there listening, just thinking through like, okay, when do you report something? When do you fix something? When do you report something as vulnerability? When other people, how do you have that discussion in a managed, professional, polite way? And then the second part is just like, okay, is this a vulnerability, Mike? I mean, it's a very wide, open-ended thing. Firefox's point of view is like any X application out there is going to have this exact same problem. This is not limited to the browser, so it's a won't fix for us. But I'm trying to look for things out on a little more of the edge, and I thought that was an interesting one.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. It's giving me a little bit of bug bounty PTSD because you're pointing out the very important aspects. One of making sure that the conversation is constructive. What are we talking about here? What is the vulnerability? What is the exploit? I think one of the things that stood out to me for this is that even the proposed patch seemed like it was addressing the reporter's exploit, but he already commented that here are some other ways that this patch fails. Here are some alternate payloads. So you don't want to, and especially when fixing a vulnerability, you don't want to just fix the exploit. You just don't want to say, well, we're going to forbid JavaScript : and we're going to string match that that's how we solve cross-site scripting. Here lie monsters. So it is a good example of just understanding how do you approach and triage and figure out what do you fix, what don't you fix from a general bug bounty perspective. Speaking of things that are ancient like X11 or maybe unrecommended, Dan in our last segments, he said one of the things you shouldn't be doing is writing your own auth stack, perhaps, or writing your own database. And I think you would agree that no one out there should be running their own MTA. So Exum has patched a couple bugs recently. And what caught my eye was that they have just come out and said, everything prior to 4.96.2 is now obsolete. And so that's a pretty impressive way to deprecate software just by fiat. It's done. We're not supporting it. But I want to generalize that in the spirit of ASW. When do you have the luxury of deprecating all those prior versions? And kind of as parallel to that, when do you have the obligation to provide security support for those prior versions? And I don't know if you want to try to answer those directly, or if maybe we should leave those as rhetorical questions for our listeners to send in some answers for.
Yeah, I'll leave them partially rhetorical because I think it's again, thinking back to metrics, right? There's probably, I think my best argument would be around if there is some percentage of rework which has to be done, or some either amount of rework or just amount of either percentage or man hours, people hours. There's some sort of metric around when do we, hit eject and say, no, that's just not going to work, right? Let's rewrite in Rust. But then I think the other aspect to me was like, when do you have, when are you obligated to do that versus when are you obligated to support it? And I think either way, the concept of providing back support on your software to your user community is sort of, I don't want to say a thing of love. It's a little too kumbaya, but it's a thing of like, you're supporting them. That's something that for whatever reason they can't upgrade. Either they can't move quick enough, or they're on a distribution which is CentOS and not upgrading very quickly, or what have you, right? And there's reasons out there. Sometimes you just can't get the latest version of something. So there's some need that you have to support at least a few versions back. I think that's reasonable. How far back you go, pick a number, right? A year or two. But to then go and say what they did here of like, if you're running before X version, we're sort of declaring vulnerability bankruptcy, right? And I mean, I guess the other side of this is like, when does either an Appsec team internally or a vuln management team say, we're not supporting that version of X software that you're running anymore, you have to update. We're tired of patching it, or the patch is not working, or the patch is taking too long, or you're still running X, or what have you. So I think there's multiple different ways to be thinking about this conversation when you have it. Yeah, so I'm not fully rhetorical. I'm trying to put some thoughts on it, but yeah.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this when we talk about CISA's Secure by Design document, because I think there's some angles in there that I think can at least help us with this conversation. But our Star Trek the Motion Picture fans out there, I can't let them down, because speaking of patching and versions, NASA they didn't patch version of V'ger 1, but V'ger 2 out there got an upgrade. How did they do?
It looks like they don't know yet. That's the thing. Let's see. The date is the 28th. Check real quickly. Article's not that long. I'll have it in a second.
October 28th is when they'll find out.
So they should have found out this weekend. For folks wondering what we're talking about. So NASA found there was a vulnerability in Voyager 1 and Voyager. I think it hit Voyager 1. I guess they're both running close enough code bases, which is the other interesting thing to think about here. But so there's a vulnerability in there where what it turned out was the system somehow, for some reason, flipped into a mode of, instead of actually executing commands, it was just logging them. And then the log started overriding some of the things, which is might sound familiar to people. But okay, you got Voyager 1, Voyager 2. V2 is closer, so it's going to be quicker to communicate with. Apparently, it's doing a little more scientifically interesting, air quotes, work. So if you had to, you've where I wanted to go with this was it's a short, simple article, right? And there's not a lot of meat behind it. But where I wanted to go is like, if I'm running this application, how do I, write an application that can be troubleshooted and debugged, troubleshot? So first it's like, okay, well, if it's something just running in my office or on a container, whatever else, right? It's fairly close and get to it. So that's one aspect. Then the next version is, okay, if I've got something, say I'm on vacation and someone is house sitting for me and something breaks and they're at the command prompt because this happens. How do they know how to troubleshoot this thing, right? Okay, so it's further away. So I'm not there. I can't. It's one thing for us to debug when we have access to clicky. When you are remote, how do you do it? Either are you getting the logs or working someone else through it? So things to think about. And then the next version of that is, if you're, 22, my math is off in the article. If you're 22 billion kilometers away, actually, no, my math is right. It's going to take a little longer, or 20 billion, depending on which one you're talking about. So how do you log through that? How do you, be able to troubleshoot what's going on, or create something so you can do this when it's like, it's gone. I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past. But then the second aspect is, once you create a patch for that, how do you test it? When you're click on saying deploy, and it's billions of kilometers away, billions of miles away. I thought that was really interesting to think about. You got to be really careful. And then which one do you patch both? Do you patch one? If one comes back, do you go ahead and patch a second? Since they are created years apart, are they going to respond the same to that patch? So that aspect of this, beside me getting another space article in here, was sort of interesting to think about from an application development and security point of view.
I think it's a great metaphor for the business considerations or the risk considerations of, we could generalize the vulnerability management rather than just saying this is a CVSS, whatever, it needs to be patched in this many days. Let's talk about the business here. And John, since you did calculate the number of punch cards for an episode, I think your math for next time is going to be at 160 bits per second to Voyager 1. How long is it going to take to upload this episode of ASW so that we can be the first podcast to leave the solar system?
It was 8 bytes per punch card, 160 bits. So it's 20 punch cards per second. I got that right? That sounds...
We'll check the math off air. I'm sure plenty of our listeners will be doing this in time with us. While the calculators are up, I'll bring us over to a PDF. And this PDF just happens to be from our friends at CISA and 15, 20 other international partners, basically a lot of co-signers who are saying, can we please have some secure by design? And I think the article, the document, the guidance is good. It's definitely high level. There are some things in there that are actionable. It does call out some secure by default, some secure by design tactics, and it breaks into 3 principles. So the 3 principles are taking ownership of customer security outcomes. And I think this speaks a little bit to what we were talking about with Dan in the sense of developers implementing OAuth, implementing WebAuthn, and trying to figure out ways to make this easier so the end user doesn't really care. They just want to authenticate. but ideally they don't have to have a password, and they have some account recovery. So there's some aspects there. Embrace radical transparency and accountability, and lead from the top. The second two, the second one, the radical transparency and accountability, I appreciate they're talking about publishing some statistics, patching, etc. But one of the things I did like is that, and I'll quote from it, beware the temptation to count CVEs as a negative metric, in other words, something like a pejorative, since such numbers are also a sign of a healthy code analysis and testing. So just because, it's basically talking about sort of that observer bias, just because we see more CVEs doesn't mean it's more insecure. It means there's more scrutiny, which can be a good thing as long as like those vuln classes are being addressed. And it's addressing of vuln classes, I think, is that first taking ownership of security outcomes is really what that the design document is going for. And it does add in this version of the PDF, one of the things that they added or said that they're focusing on is, how can a business demonstrate this? And so they did go through a couple areas of how to demonstrate that you actually have some secure by design. So this is good. I think it's more of just kind of a call to action, and it's at least leading from top down in the sense of CISA focusing on this. So hopefully the CISOs and boards will be continuing to ask, what's our security by design look like, as opposed to what are our vulnerability management numbers? How many vulns did we find this quarter versus last quarter? How many did we fix within our MTTR? Because those are the easy ones to measure, but they're not really getting us anywhere.
I need to go back to the previous story for a fraction of a second and bring this one together. I was listening to you, I promise, but I was also doing some quick math. A CVSS vector requires about 5 punch cards. With that said, this sounds familiar. Mm-hmm. And I'm not. We have commented similarly on some previous CISA stories in the past, but the reason I'm mentioning it here, lead from the top. Embrace radical transparency and accountability. I like the third one or the first one. I'm reading backwards for some reason. Take ownership of customer security outcomes. That's sort of what we're talking about for another story. But to go back to metrics, I'd love to see a metric. Is this happening? So we had the other story around boards thinking more about security. So I'd say, yeah, it's happening. I don't know, that's just where my head went on this one real quickly is okay, well, we're talking about this. We've talked about this for a while. Sounds like it's starting to take effect. Is that just because things are moving slowly, or because something like CISA saying it is actually making people stand up and take notice, or is it laws? So it'd be interesting, I think, to me to think about why now. But yeah, keep banging the drum, and hopefully people will keep going that direction.
Yeah, and even if it starts to change the Appsec industry's conversations away from just fix all the vulns and find all the vulns into, well, what does our account recovery look like for authentication? What is our authentication pattern? What is OAuth 2.1 or WebAuthn 3.0? What are the good design aspects of those? That would be wonderful for me to see. So that's where I'm hoping we see it, but still curious. We are getting low on our time because we want to be friendly. We got to be careful about that, getting this uploaded to Voyager 1. Maybe that this Beyond Trust discovers breach of Okta support unit. This was kind of interesting, and I thought there were some good AppSec lessons in here. So Beyond Trust, and for that matter, I included an article from Cloudflare that threw a little bit of shade towards Okta, saying how we mitigated yet another Okta compromise, but to be fair, this is something where the Beyond Trust said, hey, who's using this cookie to access our systems? This is a Okta administrator's cookie. And what it pointed out, what it highlighted is, in a conversation with Dan, is that some of these cookies, some of these session tokens are cryptographically bound to a device, bound to a domain, but some of them are just the random numbers that are used to identify a session and say, this is Mike, this is John. And if you can obtain and replay those, that is the easiest backdoor, easiest exploit, if you will, into a system, rather than looking for those RCEs or whatever the OAuth top 10 is going to list out. So where am I going from here? One is Oh, and there was also the HAR file. That was the other aspect. So it was recording the HAR file. So this HTTP archive, something that Burp and Zap, for that matter, can both generate. If you're capturing web traffic, you're capturing your session cookies. You're capturing a lot of sensitive info, especially if you're logging in as well. And so you do have to be careful about how you're sharing those files. They should be scrubbed, or there should be a way of using Hackverter to make sure to rewrite those sensitive cookies into just all A's or something like that. So those were how I bring everything together yet again in another week, or at least attempt to. How did I do, John?
Yeah, that's the direction I want to go, where you went at the end, which is when I was reading this, whenever I saw it, the thought in my head was like, okay, how do you, these things are going to happen. How do you make sure, how do you improve so that the next time, at least you don't have the same error? So like, how do you deal with that? So can you record, and this comes back a little bit to my comment about troubleshooting before, right? There's that concept of, you can put everything in there, but then you've got multiple problems. So do you not use that HAR archive, or do you, as you said, do you zero some of it out? Is there some way to automatically have it, maybe have a timer so you only keep them in the system for so long? So I think that's where I'd want the thought process I'd want, either myself or the listeners to sort of think through is like, how do you, so that you've got this issue, how do you make sure it doesn't happen again? And again, we talk about blameless postmortems and those type of things. So this is sort of that type of thing. It's like, okay, well, let's go grab a coffee or lunch and figure out, we need to be able to troubleshoot. Maybe how often have we actually used these things in the last 6 months to bring it back from a metrics point of view? Mm-hmm. So do we need it as being used? Are we recording it for no reason? Are we storing it? Can we store it in a better way? That's sort of where my head went, so that, my partners don't in the future say, they fix my problems again. That's not pleasant to see. I get it, but no. Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah, and it also, real quick too, with Dan, he mentioned, just the lifetime of a token. If the lifetime of a token is days and it's that secure token, that's a bigger window of risk than if it's just valid for a few seconds or a few minutes. And let's help out V'ger with one more article, perhaps, John. Where do you want to take us out on?
Well, I was going to go to a link. You had an article, not the article itself, but the article is, you probably know where I'm going already. The analysis of the BlackHole token exploit, which, as you mentioned, we haven't covered crypto coins on here for a while. I want to not just say crypto. The bad crypto, not the good crypto. We haven't covered the bad crypto on here for a while. Let's see how much we can annoy our listeners. And yeah, this is another one. It's an interesting review, I think, of sort of, what's going on, how they sort of recognized it. It seems like folks, we started off beginning of the year talking about a lot of this crypto stuff, and we were on a crypto kick for a while. Again, bad crypto. But it seems like they're getting better at recognizing issues when they happen and responding to them quicker. So, hey, good on them and all that. But what I really liked, Mike, was the link you had in there on top. Web3isgoinggreat.com. That is highly recommended for our listeners who have the same point of view as I do.
Indeed. Please check that out. And part of the reason I pulled this in was we had a conversation about business logic. I throw in scare quotes back in episode 255. And business logic is one of those things that's ill-defined, but it's about what does the application do, or securing what you sell. That was that was how Janet Worthington put it. And the reason I pulled this article in, as I mentioned in the show notes, is that these types of cryptocurrency and Web3 is going great types of vulns are excellent examples of the business logic. They're technical, and they're exploiting assumptions in how the applications were designed, or the workflows that are expected, or unexpected interplays between different APIs and different chains and bridges and so on, to get a little bit on some of the technical terms. But you don't have to be a cryptocurrency expert or fan to appreciate the sense of how these are being looked at and turn these into examples of threat modeling for the own software you're creating. But We're out of time. So I have to say thank you once again, John, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Please do subscribe, hit that like button, check out the show notes. And speaking of ancient software, check out ANSI.sys by Master Bootwrecker. It's a great track. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.